everybody, and welcome to part 3 of my Star Wars Legends Chronological review series. In this video, we are going to be reviewing the first chronological book in the Star Wars Legends timeline, Dawn of the Jedi Into the Void, as well as the short story The Adventures of Lanoree Brock, both written by author Tim Levin. This novel story follows the Jedi Ranger Lanoree Brock and is set in the year 25,793 BBY. Her journey is continued from the short story Eruption, in which at the end of that story, she received a special call from the Jedi Masters on Tython to return to her home planet for a special mission. Starting at the beginning of the book and continuing throughout the book, we get flashbacks from the perspective of Lanoree of her childhood training with her brother Dalian Brock as they both try to learn the ways of the Force on their home planet of Tython. Her brother Dalian, however, refuses to accept the Force from a young age, believing that he wants to be his own master and that the Jedi let the Force control them instead of the other way around. As the two siblings journey throughout the Tython system, Lanoree's skills in the Force only continue to grow, while Dalian continues to refuse to let the Force in, relying more on martial arts skills and his blaster to get himself out of trouble and through his training. As they grow older, the two continue to grow farther apart, despite Lanoree's best efforts to connect with him. Their journey comes to a dark conclusion at the Temple of Anil Kesh, where Dalian travels to the forbidden Abyss of Ruh, which is said to be filled with darkside power that has driven people mad in the past. Dalian kills a Jedi who tries to arrest him after he does this, and Lanoree pursues him into a desert filled with ancient ruins. As Lanoree searches the ruins, she finds the torn and bloodied clothes of his brother, believing him to be dead. In the present day, Lanoree Brock is briefed by the Jedi Masters on her special mission. She learns that her brother is actually alive, and is potentially trying to reactivate something called a hypergate on Tython, in an attempt to learn how to leave the star system and travel to the rest of the galaxy. However, because Dalian's plan involves dangerous dark matter in his technology, there is the possibility that Dalian's success means the destruction of the Tython system, as well as all of its planets and inhabitants. Lanoree's first lead takes her to the ocean planet of Kalamar, where she meets a red-skinned Twi'lek named Trey Sana, who mysteriously, his mind cannot be touched by the Force. The two travel around the planet and eventually meet an ex-Jedi named Kara, who has ties to a cult called the Stargazers, who share Dalian's wishes of being able to leave the Tython system. After they search Kara's apartment, they find the ancient journals of a man named Osmail Orr, who describes in his writings the ancient technology that might make leaving the Tython system possible. After leaving Kalamar, they track Dalian's ship to the industrial planet of Nox, and come to the domed city known as Greenwood Station, which had been bombed by the Jedi years before in the Despot Wars. After meeting one of Trey Sana's contacts named Max Hagen, they make their way down to an underground portion of the city known as Pan Deep. Lanoree fights her way through Dalian's guards and eventually sees him face to face for the first time in several years. However, Dalian appears to have little love left for his sister. Escaping with a mysterious device, one of Dalian's Stargazer servants detonates a suicide vest, and Lanoree and Trey Sana barely survive. Lanoree and Trey Sana leave just as a war begins at Greenwood Station, which Dalian had started in order to cover his escape. Narrowly escaping the carnage, Lanoree and Trey Sana track Dalian's ship again to the planet Sunspot, which is the closest planet to the Tython star. Once they make their way to Sunspot, they meet Dalian again in another underground facility. Taking Lanoree as his prisoner, Dalian shoots his sister square in the chest with a blaster and leaves her to die. Trey Sana eventually recovers her and they both flee on her ship. Back on the ship, Lanoree manages to heal her wound with the forbidden power of Force alchemy, which she was taught on Tython by her master, Dam Powell. They follow Dalian finally back to Tython, where he plans to reactivate his device in the same ruins that Lanoree presumed him to die all of those years ago. While chasing him through the ruins, Lanoree kills 3 of his henchmen, but not before one of them shoots Trey Sana in the back of the head in an attempt to save her. Fueled by rage, Lanoree finds her brother and they fight. Although Dalian manages to injure her with knives and martial arts skills, he is simply no match for somebody who is strong in the Force. Lanoree attempts one more time to have Dalian see her way, flooding his mind with memories of their childhood. While this stops him for a moment, he refuses to surrender, and Lanoree is forced to kill her brother to stop him from achieving his goals. Lanoree recovers the device and Trey Sana, and they go back to the Jedi, where the device can be held under safekeeping and studied, and Trey Sana can make his way back to health. Alright, that was the plot summary. Let's go ahead to the review. Overall, I think that Lanoree Brock is a fantastic protagonist to start this chapter of the Star Wars timeline. Her perspective is a really good one and is really interesting, and as a Force sensitive, the author does a really good job of showing through Lanoree Brock how Force sensitive people feel their surroundings and live their day-to-day lives with those additional enhanced senses. Other things about Lanoree Brock's perspective, for example, she talks a lot about her ship in the beginning of the book and the way she customized it. Seeing the galaxy through Lanoree's eyes is just really fun in general. It's also worth noting that Lanoree and I suppose the other Jedi at the time as well use metal swords instead of lightsabers, but they're pretty much treated the exact same as lightsabers. They can deflect blaster bolts and they can be used to cut through pretty much anything she needs to. They're treated a lot like the lightsabers are in modern Star Wars. She has a very close personal attachment to her weapon. Meanwhile, her brother Dal starts out as a fantastic villain who has really interesting motivations and origins. He's sort of a villain whose villainous motivations are rooted in pride and being unwilling to use the Force and wanting to prove himself by not using it is a really interesting angle for a Star Wars villain that I don't know has been done in any other piece of Star Wars media before, and is a really compelling and convincing foil to the protagonist. And of course, because the two are siblings, the conflict sort of continues Star Wars' main theme of family and conflict within family. However, as the book continues in both the flashback portions and in the present day portions, I feel that Dalian and his motivations sort of became really cartoonishly evil, and his appeal got lost to me as the book went on. It's never really clear why he doesn't want to use the Force exactly, what made him feel so strongly about that from a young age. It's not that he couldn't. He is Force sensitive. It's that he just doesn't want to. I actually spent most of my time reading the book thinking that, oh, he just couldn't feel the Force and that's why he's so resentful and wants to try and use it. No, he just refuses to. I honestly think it probably would have been more impactful if the author or the story group decided to make the villain one that couldn't feel the Force and was grown up in a family, in a society where being able to use the Force is really important. We don't really see a lot of Star Wars media, or at least I haven't yet, that discuss things like that. The movies don't really discuss the divisions between those who can use the Force and those that cannot. You know, we don't really see someone like Han Solo or Poe Dameron like really take a look at something that the Force sensitive characters can do and be like, I really wish I could do that. And you know, even if they do, it doesn't, you know, they just have their own abilities and their own ways that they help. It's just a little unbelievable that someone that could feel the Force would just outright decide not to, if not for a clear reason. I feel like some little kid that would be able to move things with his mind would want to. We also find out towards the end of the book that Dalian's grand plan was probably mostly influenced by other people, like the character Kara I mentioned earlier, and I feel like that takes away a lot of the agency and power that he did have. It's just, I don't know, saying that there were other people involved behind the scenes after he was dead, just that part was kind of lazily thrown in there at the end, and I'm not really sure what that was supposed to add to the story. I have to say the side characters, especially Trey Sana, were a fantastic addition to the story and really energized the plot as Lanoree Brock hopped her way from planet to planet. The world building is pretty interesting in a lot of good ways and in some bad ways. The Tython system and its culture is made up of many different species, which feels a little odd for a society where hyperspace travel isn't very common. Of course, that's explained, you know, earlier in the Dawn of the Jedi first issues, those comics where the Tho-Yor take members of all different species and planets and take them to Tython. It just thematically, I suppose, doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the very beginning of galactic society and for every planet you go to be a cosmopolitan society just like Coruscant. You know, everywhere is diverse, and while it does make sense for the world that has already been established, I feel like a more singular or a little more homogenized culture could have worked a little better for the setting. But considering that this book came out after the era had already been established, I don't really think it's the author's fault. It just feels like the fact that this is a pre-hyperspace travel galaxy doesn't really matter that much to the plot or to the world building. Lanoree will be in her ship and it'll be like, it'll take us 3 weeks to get to this next planet, and then they'll just skip those 3 weeks in the next chapter and they'll be right back onto the next planet. It's not the biggest criticism, but the world building in this book doesn't really reflect what you might expect from the world building of a very ancient galactic society. The plot structure and the pacing was definitely a plus. This book wastes very little time going from location to location or from flashback to present day, and it's definitely a very snappy read. Some of the action scenes could probably have been a little more coherent in knowing what exactly was going on in the fight, but maybe that's just me. I don't think I've ever really enjoyed many fighting or action scenes in books. I also wanted to point out that the plot concludes with a bunch of large force storms happening on Tython's surface. At first, Lanoree suspects that this is happening because of Dalian's actions and what he is about to do, but then it's revealed that it actually has to do with something completely different and has to do with events that happen concurrently in the comics, starting with Force Storm issue 2. Now, when they had mentioned it in that part in the books, I had actually read ahead already to that part of the comics, and that was cool, having coincidentally read that and then seeing in the book that those events were happening at the same time. But I imagine that someone who hadn't read the comics yet would be a little bit confused on what was going on if they hadn't already read those comics. So as for the author's writing style, I thought it was really good for the most part. It was descriptive yet concise. Every once in a while, I would come across a passage or a sentence where I felt like he could have lost a word or put in an extra word to make things a little more clear or make it flow a little better, but overall that's kind of just a nitpick. His style lacks some subtlety at times. There's definitely some Maid and Butler type obvious exposition dumping, especially at the beginning. Sometimes the characters don't really talk as if they're real people. A lot of the times the characters talk as if it's just the author talking to the reader, and it's really clear in some points more than others. They say stuff at the beginning of the book like, as you know, that war that happened 10 years ago really hurt a lot of people, and it's like people who had actually lived through those events the way that they did in this setting wouldn't say things like that, but sometimes there's no real easier way to drop exposition quickly to the reader, so I really don't mind it that much. There's also certain point, like at the end of a chapter or at the end of a paragraph, it'll say something like, the next day would be one that Lanoree would never forget. And it kind of just breaks the tension a little bit, knowing that something really important is about to happen and just telling you that outright before you actually get there. And like I said before, some of the dialogue happens and it doesn't sound like real people talking. It ends up being really cheesy at some points, especially Dalian. Lanoree and Dalian will be talking, and there will be like young kids, like no older than 12, and you see Dalian saying stuff like, once I've taken all I can from Tython, I'm leaving this wretched place. And it's like, dude, you're 15 at the oldest. I think you should calm down just a little bit. Yeah, it really just feels like the author has it out for Dalian at some points, and like I said, sometimes his writing is really not very subtle. Just like how I said, there will be the end of a chapter or a paragraph where it will foreshadow something bad is about to happen. They'll kind of do the same thing with Dalian. Instead, it'll say something like, little did Lanoree know that the next day, Dalian would shit his pants in front of everybody, and they would all laugh at him because he couldn't hold in his shit with the Force. It doesn't actually say that, but it definitely feels like it does. If you've read this book, then you know what I'm talking about. Also, a quick little note, the tense is past tense when it's talking about the things that happen in the present day, and then it's talking in present tense when it's talking about the flashbacks, which is a little weird if you think about it, but when you're reading it, it's not actually that confusing. There's a lot of humor in this book, a lot of quips and one-liners, especially between Lanoree Brock and Trey Sana. And I'd say it works a lot of the time, probably closer to the first half of the book, but in the second half of the book, when the stakes get a little higher, it doesn't really work for them to be, cracking smirks and side glances, as they're jumping off a ship about to kill a bunch of people. It just doesn't, the humor doesn't really work at some points. Also, one more thing, this book is a lot more violent than I expected. Lanoree, as I mentioned earlier, uses a metal sword to kill people, and sometimes the dismemberment and the blood is described very graphically. It didn't bother me that much, but it definitely surprised me for a Star Wars book. But I suppose since this book is sort of written for more of the hardcore fans, I imagine people who are a little older, and also because it's a book and not a movie, I feel like they can get away with it. Because it came out a little bit before the book did, I imagine this is just the author's way to let people who are interested in the book know about the main character and sort of the coming conflict for the book before the book came out. Overall, with this book, I think I enjoyed myself a lot more than I thought I was going into it. I think the general consensus is that this book is fairly mediocre in terms of writing, and I would kind of agree a little bit, but I think people are a little too harsh in the general consensus of what this book is, and overall, I generally enjoyed myself. I think a common theme of this series is to not let preconceived notions get in the way of what you might enjoy, especially because Legends is filled with a lot of out there stuff. I have to say, this probably is not among the best of the Star Wars Legends books, I can already tell, but it was a short and quick and enjoyable read. Honestly, I liked the first half of the book way better. I think that the closer that they got to finding Dalian and as the stakes grew, I just got more tired of the flaws that I saw in the prose, and honestly the ending felt pretty anticlimactic as well. Honestly, I think that my final rating would be a 7 out of 10 for this book. It was a nice and quick read, but there were some frustrating elements in the plot and in the prose that kept me from really fully enjoying myself. As for the previous material that we've read before, I'd say reading Dawn of the Jedi issues 0 and 1, as well as the short story Eruption before this, definitely are necessary to fully understand the world building and just constructing in your mind what the era is like. It really benefits having been introduced to those elements of the world beforehand. And of course, we do have to talk about the short story The Adventures of Lanoree Brock, which was released shortly before the novel was. And I have to say that there is really almost nothing to talk about here. The story is set between chapters 2 and 3 of the book, and it pretty much just is Lanoree sitting in her ship and writing in her ship's log about her thoughts going back to Tython for the first time in a long time, but it doesn't really add any interesting insight into her character or add any details that become important or relevant in the book. I'd say that you can definitely skip this short story, but it's only a few paragraphs, so. Unfortunately, it seems that Lanoree Brock will not continue her journey as a Jedi. From what I've seen, the short story Eruption and this novel are the only real pieces of Star Wars media that feature her, and she isn't featured in any of the upcoming comics because this book came out after the Dawn of the Jedi comics. Unfortunately, this is the last we are going to see of her, which is unfortunate because I really liked her point of view. I imagine that this book likely had the potential to be a part of a trilogy or a further book series, because it was published in 2014, which is pretty much right when Disney shut Legends down. I imagine if the author had a little bit more time to get comfortable with the universe and stretch out to some more interesting ideas, I think that he could have made books centered around Lanoree Brock that were even more interesting than this one. So in conclusion, for part 3, I would definitely recommend checking out Dawn of the Jedi Into the Void. Do not listen to people who are telling you not to read Legends chronologically, because honestly, discovering the Star Wars universe this way is already a whole lot of fun. You know, maybe I'll get burnout and I'll totally eat those words, but honestly, so far I'm having a lot of fun. By the time I'm recording this, I am starting to read the comics, and I am enjoying the comics even more than I enjoyed this book. I just think that this era of the Star Wars timeline is really interesting. If you're watching this video and you haven't read Dawn of the Jedi Into the Void yet, I would definitely recommend checking it out. In my plot summary, I definitely covered the most relevant plot points, but I had to leave a ton of stuff out to get this video at a reasonable length. I imagine that is something I'm going to have to do, covering these novels going forward. Also, real quick, just a couple of things that I wanted to mention before I end this video. I wanted to issue a correction on my last video. I mentioned in my last video that there is a character named the Crime Lord Shikakwa. I got that wrong. The name of the character is the Crime Lord Hadia, and Shikakwa is the name of one of the planets. Also, a lot of the art and visual references I used in this video is concept art based on the novel by concept artist Albert Ermanov. I'm going to be putting his ArtStation account in the description below. This was very helpful to use in my video because, because this is a book, this is a novel, there's not a lot of visual elements to go off of, so this fan-made art was extremely helpful in adding in those visual references for you guys to see. Alright, well that's it for today's video. Part 4 is going to be covering the next 4 issues of Dawn of the Jedi Force Storm. Please feel free to drop a like and subscribe if you want to see more from this series and you want to help my channel grow. Of course, I'm going to continue the series and hopefully drop these videos more frequently, but I also have some ideas for bigger videos that don't necessarily have to do with Star Wars. I hope you have a wonderful day, and may the Force be with you always.